July 27th, 1944. The German line in Normandy finally broke. For nearly 7 weeks after D-Day, American units had been grinding forward hedgerow by hedgerow. Progress was measured in fields and farm lanes. Casualties were measured in thousands. The front looked solid. The war felt stuck. Then, in a single burst of movement, everything changed. Reports began to stack up at First Army headquarters. German battalions falling back without orders. Roadblocks abandoned. Tanks moving south at full speed into country that was no longer boxed in by hedges. The map that had barely shifted in June now showed open gaps in the German front and American units pushing deep beyond the old line. For the first time, Paris was not just a distant objective. It was a realistic next step if the Americans could keep that momentum, and the formation that had opened that path was not an army group or a whole army. It was one American corps that had punched a hole straight through the German defenses and then refused to stop. At the center of that corps stood a man almost no one outside the profession remembers. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commander of 7th Corps, had just done something no Allied headquarters in the West had managed since the landings. He had taken a front, built to bleed attackers dry, and turned it into ground his own forces could move through at speed. 4 days later, the newly activated United States Third Army under George Patton would drive through that gap and roar across France in one of the fastest advances of the war. Patton would become the public face of the breakout. His name would be tied forever to the dash out of Normandy. But the breakthrough that allowed that advance was created by another general. J. Lawton Collins did not look like the popular image of a battlefield hero. In 1944, he was 48 years old. Compact, calm, almost reserved. He had spent years as an instructor at the infantry school at Fort Benning, drilling young officers on tactics, map reading, and the dull details of staff work. Omar Bradley knew him from those days. Quiet, precise, more interested in getting the plan right than in giving speeches. In the Pacific, that reserve had fooled people. Then he took the 25th Infantry Division through Guadalcanal and New Georgia. He drove his units hard, kept them moving when the jungle and the enemy both tried to pin them down. His troops started calling him Lightning Joe. It was not a marketing slogan. And it was the field's way of saying this man did not waste momentum. Not everyone saw it. When the War Department looked for corps commanders, Douglas MacArthur refused to take Collins for a corps in the Southwest Pacific. Too junior. Not enough seniority for a command of that weight, he said. That kind of thing mattered in the peacetime army. On paper, Collins was just another promising officer who could wait his turn. Bradley, preparing for the Normandy invasion under Eisenhower, did not care about peacetime seniority charts. He wanted corps commanders who could learn fast, improvise under fire, and keep pressure on the enemy without losing control. Men who thought like staff officers but moved like cavalry. That is why, when it came time to assign a corps to Utah Beach and the drive beyond it, Bradley asked for Collins by name. I 7th Corps would land on the right flank of the American beachhead. The map objective was the Cotentin Peninsula. The real prize sat at its northern tip, Cherbourg. By the summer of 1944, logistics ruled the war. Every rifle, shell, and can of gasoline the Allies used in France had to cross the Channel. The planners expected temporary artificial harbors, the mulberries, to carry much of that load. Then, in late June, a massive storm wrecked the American mulberry off Omaha Beach. That storm quietly rewrote the importance of Cherbourg. From then on, if that port did not come online, the whole campaign on the continent would run short of everything. Think about that. The Germans understood this as well as the Allies did. They had 4 years to fortify the approaches to Cherbourg. Concrete gun positions dominated the sea. Heavy artillery covered the land routes. They laced the peninsula with obstacles and strongpoints. They blew bridges, mined crossroads, and wired farmhouses for defense. They turned the city and its surrounding forts into something close to a coastal citadel. Collins had to land on a hostile beach, push his corps across the peninsula through prepared defenses, and take that port in weeks, not months. The original plan called for Cherbourg to fall within roughly 9 days of D-Day. Officers who had seen German coastal defenses elsewhere thought that prediction was fantasy. On D-Day itself, 7th Corps came ashore on Utah Beach and, thanks to current and tide, I landed slightly south of the intended zones. A more rigid commander might have tried to shift everything back to the original plan. Collins did the opposite. He accepted where his units were, adjusted on the fly, and drove inland toward the causeways that led off the flooded low ground. He was not chasing a perfect arrow on a staff map. He was chasing time. When other formations paused to tidy up their lines and dig in, Collins pushed his divisions north. Day after day, 7th Corps fought up the Cotentin, taking fields and villages whose names most Americans never learned. The fighting was close, personal, and costly. German rearguards forced the Americans to attack across open ground again and again. Collins kept issuing the same basic guidance. Advance, keep moving. Keep the enemy from building a coherent new line. On the 22nd of June, his forward units reached the outskirts of Cherbourg. The German commander refused to capitulate. Collins answered with a carefully staged assault from several directions at once, using infantry, tanks, and artillery to squeeze the garrison. 5 days later, organized resistance ceased. By the end of the summer, engineers had repaired enough of the wrecked port to bring in tens of thousands of tons of supplies each day. Ammunition, fuel, food, vehicles, replacement troops. All of it flowed through the port Collins had wrestled out of German hands. It was the logistical bloodstream that kept American armies operating deep in France. The headlines barely lasted a news cycle. Cherbourg was treated as one success among many. Collins got his photograph in the papers and a few glowing lines, and then the story moved on. South of the port, the real nightmare of the Normandy campaign was tightening its grip. Walk a hedgerow field in Normandy, and you understand why. Ancient earth banks, waist-high or higher, packed with tangled roots and topped with thick hedges, divide the countryside into tiny compartments. In 1944, those banks were as hard as stone. Tanks that tried to climb them often hung up, exposing their thin belly armor. Infantry crossing open gaps between fields became perfect targets. Every field was a little killing ground. American troops found themselves advancing at a pace measured in yards each day. A unit might lose a dozen men just to move from one hedged enclosure to the next. German machine gunners, mortar crews, and snipers used the terrain like a fortress. Many American soldiers never saw the enemy soldier who shot them. They just stepped into a slit of open ground and never reached the other side. Engineers and frontline improvisers tried to answer. One famous example was the so-called Rhino device, a set of teeth welded to the front of Sherman tanks, built from scrap steel cut from German beach obstacles. Those teeth let tanks tear straight through the base of a hedgerow instead of climbing over it. Helpful, yes, but not enough to solve the larger problem. By mid-July, First Army had pushed only a modest distance inland from the beaches. The original plans had imagined the Americans much deeper into France by that point, linking up more cleanly with the British and Canadians. Instead, Bradley watched his army bleed in the thickets and wondered how long the stalemate could last before German reinforcements made things worse. He needed a way to turn this enclosed, grinding fight into open country. On paper, the German position also looked dangerous. They had divisions strung out, some badly mauled, some still effective, all tied into the hedgerow maze. Their higher headquarters, 7th Army and Panzer Group West, were under constant pressure. Allied air attacks had cratered roads and smashed command posts. Radio nets were frayed. Telephone lines were vulnerable to every bomb and stray shell. But as long as the front remained a series of small, disconnected local battles, the German commander could patch his line with reserves and local counterattacks. That is what had to change. Bradley wanted a clean rupture at one place on the front, something beyond anything they had attempted so far. Across the lines, the British had tried their own big set-piece effort with Operation Goodwood east of Caen. Heavy bombers, massed armor, a narrow front. They had achieved some gains, but not the kind of decisive break that would roll up the entire German position. Bradley studied that result carefully. The concept of using air power to blast a corridor open still appealed to him, but he wanted someone on the ground who would not freeze when things got messy. The plan he approved for the Americans they called Operation Cobra. He'd concentrate air and artillery on a small section of the front, smash the German defenders with an enormous bombardment, then pour armor through the resulting hole before the enemy could patch it. It would be, at that point, the most ambitious American offensive in the European theater. The sector chosen for the assault lay west of St. Lo, along a relatively straight stretch of road. That road would become the axis of advance. Bradley gave the mission to the Corps commander he trusted most when the situation demanded both speed and control. 7th Corps, J. Lawton Collins. There was a catch. 7th Corps had just finished Cherbourg and had been fighting continuously for weeks. Some officers argued that fresher units should get the lead role. Bradley brushed those doubts aside. He believed that the quality of command would matter more than the number of days a division had been on the line. He wanted the same calm aggressiveness that had taken Cherbourg applied now to a very different kind of battle. On the 24th of July, something like 2,000 American aircraft moved into position to deliver an enormous bombing run on a zone just ahead of Collins's lines. The idea was simple. Mark a rectangle of German-held ground, let the bombers pulverize it, then send the infantry and tanks through what was left. Reality did not cooperate. Clouds moved in. Communication between the aircrews and the ground was not perfect. Some of the heavy bombers, approaching parallel to the front instead of perpendicular to it, released early. Bombs fell short. They landed among the very American units that were supposed to exploit the attack. Men who had dug in to watch the show instead found themselves buried, mangled, or deafened by explosions from their own side. Hundreds were killed or wounded before Collins ever gave an order to advance. The attack had to be postponed to the next day. The shock on morale was obvious. Imagine waiting all day under fire for a plan to begin, only to have your own air force tear up your positions. The next morning, the 25th of July, the bombers returned in even greater strength. This time the weather cooperated, but the same basic geometry remained. Bombs again fell short and long. Once more, American units took casualties from their own side. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, a senior officer who had come forward to observe the operation. For the soldiers on that part of the front, the world became a roaring, vibrating blur of dust, smoke, and concussion. Men emerged from foxholes stunned, with ringing ears and lungs full of dirt. When the noise finally died down, a hard question remained. Was the German line in front of 7th Corps destroyed or merely wounded? Collins was watching all of this from his command post, studying the map and listening to fragmentary reports. He knew exactly how many of his own troops he had already lost to the short bombing. He understood that if the German defenses were still intact, asking his infantry to walk into that wrecked ground might turn into a massacre. The first reports after the barrage were not encouraging. Small German strongpoints that had escaped the bombs opened fire on the advancing American infantry. Machine guns that had been missed chewed into the attackers. Progress along the designated axis of advance was measured in fields, not miles. Bradley, looking over the wider front, began to worry that Cobra might become another failed offensive in the hedgerows. This is the point where Collins earns the place that history never quite gave him. As the day went on, more pieces of information flowed into 7th Corps headquarters. Prisoners from shattered German units talked about confusion. Some did not seem to know which division they belonged to anymore. Liaison reports spoke of German counterattacks that stumbled into one another, arriving late, unsupported, or attacking in the wrong direction. Intercepted messages hinted that higher German headquarters could not get a clean picture of what was happening at the front. Collins looked at all of that and reached a conclusion that went against his own doctrine and against the cautious instincts of many American commanders. He decided that even though the infantry had not yet cleared all the bombed ground, the German command structure in that sector was broken enough to take a larger risk. He ordered his armored divisions forward early, and the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions were to drive through the narrow lanes and gaps, bypass surviving strongpoints wherever possible, and push deep, not just a few thousand yards. This went far beyond the initial written plan. If the Germans still had solid reserves in front, those tank columns could be trapped and torn apart in the kind of close terrain where armor is vulnerable and infantry is king. No one could make that call for him. If he guessed wrong, he would not only lose his position, he could compromise the entire American beachhead by throwing away the mobile forces Bradley needed for later operations. Collins sent them anyway. On the 26th, those armored spearheads began to find exactly what he had gambled on. Gaps. German units that should have been in specific woods or along certain hedgerows were simply not there. Bridges that should have been covered by anti-tank guns were either lightly held or only defended by scattered groups of infantry who had already been hammered by the bombers. Tank commanders moved forward expecting to be ambushed every few hundred yards. Instead, they found columns of German vehicles abandoned on the roadside, wrecked from the air or simply left behind when fuel ran out. They rolled past smashed command posts, overturned field kitchens, and limping soldiers who no longer knew where their regiments were supposed to be. By the 27th, the same day that staff officer in the German command dugout was trying to sketch a line that no longer existed, the German 7th Army was reporting multiple breaks in its front and admitting that it had no reserves available to seal them. The careful, suffocating hedgerow war stopped being possible. The Americans could finally use their strength in mobile warfare. That is the opening we talk about today as the Normandy breakout. It was not a clean, simple corridor through nicely flattened ground. It was a chaotic wound in an entire defensive system, widened quickly by a corps commander willing to risk his armor before anyone at higher levels felt comfortable. 4 days later, on the 1st of August, the United States Third Army under George Patton officially became operational. Patton had spent months in England commanding a phantom formation, the fictional force group used to mislead German intelligence into expecting a landing in the Pas de Calais. The deception worked. German planners held back real divisions to watch that area, even while Normandy burned. Now the man they feared most was finally given a real army and an open gate. His mission was straightforward: exploit the rupture created by Collins and 7th Corps, drive deep, swing wide, and roll up German forces that were already disorganized and retreating. Patton did exactly that. His columns raced through the countryside, covering distances that stunned even hardened staff officers. Towns fell in quick succession. German commanders who had been fighting in hedgerows found themselves retreating across open country, trying not to be cut off. And this is the part you already know. The dash across France, the colourful quotes, the polished helmet, the riding breeches, the ivory-handled pistols. War correspondents loved it. They rode along with Third Army columns, filed dramatic stories, and put Patton's name in every headline they could. The public back home, reading newspapers and watching newsreels, naturally came to believe that the breakout from Normandy was Patton's masterpiece. They rarely saw the man whose corps had actually broken the German line. While Third Army raced across the map, 7th Corps kept doing the jobs that did not lend themselves to romantic headlines. They fought their way toward and into Aachen, the first major German city to fall to the Western Allies. They forced passages through parts of the Siegfried Line, those belts of concrete bunkers and dragon's teeth that had been built in the 1930s as the West Wall. They fought in built-up areas, in forests, and along rivers where there was no room for sweeping armoured photography. When the Germans launched their last major offensive in the West in December, the attack we remember as the Battle of the Bulge, Collins and 7th Corps were again given a key role that looks, on a map, more modest than it felt on the ground. While other formations held the northern shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge and Patton's Third Army pivoted north to relieve Bastogne, Collins drove 7th Corps into the flank of the German salient. That pressure, applied on the right piece of the map at the right time, helped pinch off the bulge and forced German units to abandon heavy equipment they could not afford to lose. If you read the newspapers from that winter, you see the same pattern as in the summer. Patton's rapid march to Bastogne captured the public imagination. It deserved credit. It was a skillful maneuver carried out in brutal winter conditions. But the equally necessary blows, landing from other directions, including those directed by Collins, never got the same attention. It is hard to make careful pressure and methodical encirclement look theatrical. Inside the professional military world and inside the enemy camp, the judgment was different. Bradley later wrote that if another American field army had been created in Europe, Collins would have been a leading candidate to command it despite his relative youth. Several German generals, questioned after the war, named Collins as one of the two best American corps commanders they had faced. Even for them, the name called up memories of a corps that kept advancing, that exploited gaps ruthlessly, and that seemed to regain momentum even after exhausting fights. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, J. Lawton Collins did not vanish. He rose. He served as Army Chief of Staff during the first years of the Korean War, wrestling with a new conflict on a different continent, this time as the man at the top of the uniformed hierarchy. He received the Army Distinguished Service Medal 3 times. The Soviet Union, which did not hand out honors lightly to Western officers, awarded him the Order of Suvorov twice for his contribution to the common fight against Nazi Germany. His family name would surface again in a very different context. In July 1969, his nephew Michael Collins orbited the moon in the Apollo 11 command module, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the surface. Another quiet professional in a role where the public spotlight mostly belonged to someone else. And yet, despite all of that, if you stop a random person and ask them to name an American general from the European theater in World War II, the odds are high they will say Patton, maybe Eisenhower, maybe Bradley, almost never Collins. That is not because he failed. The record is clear. He led the corps that took the port that made sustained operations in France possible. He commanded the corps that finally turned the hedgerow stalemate into a rushing advance across open country by making a risk-heavy call after one of the worst friendly fire episodes of the war. But he played central roles in cracking the German border defenses and in crushing their last offensive in the West. The reason is simpler and more uncomfortable. Public memory tends to follow the loudest story, not the most important stuff map. Patton cultivated an image, spoke in a way that reporters could quote, and ended up as the face of American offensive spirit. Collins looked more like a meticulous accountant of violence than a movie general. He did not chase headlines. He chased results. In a sense, the breakout from Normandy had two authors. One created the break and took the personal risk of pushing forces through it before anyone knew for sure how damaged the enemy really was. The other seized that opening and turned it into a famous dash that cameras could follow from town to town. Both roles mattered. One was visible to the public and easy to mythologize. The other lived mostly in field orders, after action reports, and the quiet respect of enemies who had watched their positions crumble under a corps commander they barely knew by face. When we talk about who deserves credit for the Normandy breakout, we are really asking a broader question. Do we remember wars through the lens of personality, or through the cold chain of cause and effect that runs from an overlooked order in a crowded command post to a front line suddenly breaking wide open? The German staff officer in that dugout on the 27th of July did not know George Patton's press reputation. He knew only that somewhere opposite his sector, an American corps was acting faster and hitting harder than his own headquarters could manage. The name at the top of that corps was J. Lawton Collins. Patton made the story exciting. Collins made the breakthrough real. If you want more straight talk about the people who actually moved the arrows on the map in the Second World War, not just the ones who ended up on posters, stay with this channel. There are plenty of other forgotten professionals buried in those declassified files. And next time you see a film montage of tanks racing across France, remember that those tracks are running on a decision made by a quiet corps commander studying a wall of bad news and choosing to push forward anyway.